But what Donna has asked me to come talk about today is a little bit about how the comp plan and the wetlands protections in it are preventing or reducing the potential for problems within our own watershed. So I've got about 20 slides that we're going to go through here talking about wetlands, and over the years I have spoken to you several times about wetlands because it seems it is a never-ending challenge for us to protect wetlands even within our own county. You may remember a number of years ago I spoke to you when the attack was on isolated wetlands. The powers that were in powers that be that were in power on the county commission at that time were telling us we needed to make a sacrifice. We could either have wetlands within our urban services boundary, or we could have development. It was either or. Well, I came and I made a pitch to all of you that isolated wetlands are important. They're important for water recharge. They're important for wildlife habitat. They're important so that we don't get a concrete jungle. And all of you responded to that, and we were able to beat down that commission, and we have kept our isolated wetlands. A couple years later, there was the whole issue of delineated wetlands, and the powers that were in power at the county commission at that time were saying the only way we're going to protect these wetlands is if they are delineated. And we know that 90% of the wetlands in Martin County have never had anyone go out and specifically ring the exact location of the boundary. So that was an issue that went away. Well, now we're on a new challenge, having seen what happened last year because of the river, and so we're going to talk about some of the values of wetlands and what our comp plan is doing here. There is a very long technical definition about wetlands, what wetlands are. The bottom criteria I've listed there at the bottom of the slide. What defines a wetland is a combination of vegetation, soils, and hydrology. And we're going to talk about a few of those things before we get into the bigger picture of how they help us out here in Martin County. Let's start with talking about wetland vegetation, because there are certainly species that everybody recognizes as wetland species. Cypress trees and mangroves, no question about that. Those are called obligates. They have to live in a wetland area. Then there's this whole other group of plants called facultative wetland plants. These are ones that generally they like wetlands, but they could grow right in your front yard if you wanted them. And so the examples that I've got there are a strangler fig, and this little plant here that in the scientific community we know is hydrocotta. It's a little plant that never gets very big. The folks who want you to spread chemicals on your lawn call it dollar weed, and they want you to buy herbicides and spray them on your lawn to kill that dollar weed. Well, it's a wetland plant. If it's growing in your front yard, it's because already you are overwatering your yard. If you want to kill dollar weed, don't go to Home Depot and buy herbicide. Just cut back on your irrigation and dollar weed's going to go away. Then there's another category of plants that are on the state's wetland plant list, but they're called invisible. Cabbage palms and Brazilian peppers, things like that. They're ones that they can grow in wetlands, but they don't necessarily have to. Changes in vegetation happen pretty quickly, though. You know, over a couple of years or maybe a decade, the whole assemblage of plants can change. So the state has said, let's not just look at plants. Let's also look at wetland soils, because that takes a long time, decades really, for the soils to show the kind of characteristics of wetlands and then to change back. So here in Martin County, where the Conservation Alliance has gone to battle a number of times, is somebody has come in and cleared land. And then how do you say whether it was wetlands that was cleared illegally or not? Well, you can look at those soil conditions, because the soils have taken decades to change, and you can say, okay, the wetland plants are gone, but we know it used to be a wetland because of its soils. Another much more difficult issue to analyze is wetland hydrology. And essentially that's saying how that water level changes over a period of time. And it's very difficult here in Martin County because, as you know, we have a very wet season some years and a very dry wet season other years. So a cypress tree that may have a couple feet of standing water during the rainy season, you come back during the dry season, there may be no standing water whatsoever. So it is challenging. You look at a variety of different criteria to tell whether it is historically a wetland or not. But then we're going to hone in a little bit even more on hydrology. There's an example up there at the top about the water level fluctuating, but some of the other issues that we are definitely concerned about, and the comp plan helps us out with, is water quality. Whether it is good, clean, clear, fresh water, or the nutrient-laden water that ends up having us have those algae blooms in the freshwater systems, or certainly seagrass die-offs and that sort of thing in the coastal areas. Another issue that we've got to increasingly focus on is water timing. And yes, over the years, I think we have been duped, and we are learning. Often the Water Management District and various governmental entities will quote us an average. They're going to say, and Mark Perry probably would have jumped right on this before, because often they talk about the average salinity at a certain place in the Indian River Lagoon or the St. Lucie Estuary. That is a killer. If the oysters die when the salinity gets down below 10 or so, well, when we have very high salinity during the dry season, well, the salinity in the ocean and the river may be 40 or more. Well, average out that 40 and that 10, and you get, maybe it's 20 or something like that. Well, as Mark was showing us, if it stays depressed for a long period of time, you're going to end up having those oysters die, the seagrasses die, and everything else. So we are increasingly asking for the specific data to show us that those biota are not being killed. So timing is a big key. The picture that I've got down there, if we get 26 inches of rain in 24 hours, that's going to be the issue. We're going to have flooded subdivisions and that sort of thing. What we need to try to do is be spreading out all of those issues, all of that sort of rainwater runoff over longer periods of time. I don't have to go into, I don't think, a whole lot of details about the value of wetlands, but this is a very good graphic from the Green Planet Ethics that I saw. It doesn't, I don't think, do it justice for all of us because it doesn't show the human element in it. But as far as all of the vital functions and values of wetlands, very definitely they're all here. Their wetlands are acting as kidneys, absorbing all of that stormwater runoff, letting the plants uptake those nutrients before they get out into the open water areas, certainly habitat for fish and birds and all that sort of thing. And certainly for the human element of it, for Martin County, there in our coastal areas, very definitely those wetlands are providing a variety of values for us. In the big picture across the country, it's no wonder we've got the problems that we do. Here are some statistics, and granted, this is several years old, but the amount of wetland losses all across the country, it's pretty amazing when you look at it. So we see a lot of media coverage about, well, let's just take an example, fires in California. It seems like there's what the media call natural disasters all the time. Well, if you destroy 91% of your wetlands, don't you expect that there's going to be fires during the rainy season? Similarly, look across sort of the Midwest, the breadbasket of the country. We're always hearing about the problems that those corn farmers and wheat farmers are having as far as droughts. And again, the media will tell us those are natural disasters. Well, look at it. If in Illinois or Iowa, Indiana, if you destroy over 85% of your wetlands, you are going to be subject to drought. It is not a natural disaster. It is the effect of the lack of regulation that has allowed the drainage of those wetlands. Here in Martin County, or in Florida, we're not quite so bad. We're not up to that 50% threshold. And I have not seen any good statistics on Martin County's wetland loss over the years. Certainly when you compare us to the counties around us, we have done very well. I mentioned that wetlands at some times are very hard to identify. So without going onto a private property, piece of property that is privately owned and getting that landowner's approval, there are a variety of things that you can do to try to figure out if wetlands had been there. So this is kind of a complicated graphic, but it gives you the overlays of where there's a wetland soil and something called the National Wetland Index that also has criteria that help us out. It would be an interesting analysis to look at the big picture as to see the amount of wetland losses that we have had here in Martin County. Overall, they are much lower than other counties, but we certainly have had them. And I think in one of the years when we at this growth management forum, we were talking about wetland mitigation. And unfortunately, those problems and projects still happen now. It's certainly no secret that when things like Jensen Beach High School was permitted a number of years ago, they filled in wetlands there, and they mitigated by creating wetlands in St. Lucie County. That did nothing to help our St. Lucie River estuary or any river lagoon. So sorry, Crystal, if one of the issues is on a historic wetland at Jensen Beach High School. Similarly, as the Smiths know, the Indian Street Bridge, now the Veterans Memorial Bridge, was a very controversial issue a number of years ago. Same sort of thing. The impacts were here locally, and the mitigation for that was on Hutchinson Island in St. Lucie County and miles away. The reality of it is that we have certainly had wetland losses in spite of the very strict provisions in Martin County's comprehensive plan. One of the things that the comp plan does very well, and Maggie, maybe we're to thank you for this because it happened many decades ago, the county identified wetlands of special concern. And although a lot of us might say many of those should be a lot larger than they really are, in actuality, this is what the comp plan has adopted, and so you see a number of them. Indian River Lagoon area, Loxahatchee, are ones that you would expect as being very sensitive. So thank you for doing that back in the 1980s. Is that when that was approved? Donna came to me one time several years ago and she said, "Can wetlands disappear?" And I ended up being an expert witness on the case that you were working on that time. And unfortunately, the answer is yes, wetlands can disappear. Is it legal? Well, sometimes it is legal, sometimes it is not. This is an aerial photo. The Guardian sponsored some aerial photography that we were doing back 2 years or so ago when this particular project was an issue. I won't name it by name, but if any of you recognize the roads, you'll see Bridge Road down here and Pratt Whitney Road off in the background. And so yes, wetlands can disappear. How do they disappear? Well, you can be as bold as to dig a ditch that goes right from the wetland off the property. If you're a little bit more sneaky, you can just ring the entire wetland with a ditch that allows the runoff that would normally come into the wetland to be directed elsewhere. Does it happen overnight? No, certainly not. It takes decades sometimes for the wetland to completely disappear. Does it happen? Unfortunately it does, and I guess it shows that we need to be a little bit more diligent so that we don't have to prove in the past what has happened. One of the things that Maggie has been working on and the Guardians of the Conservation Alliance has been supportive of during the last year is the whole issue of shoreline protection zones. We've recognized that the further away from the shoreline you allow development, the better those wetlands and that sort of edge effect is able to remove nutrients and that sort of thing. So a particularly sticky wicket of the last couple of years has indeed how to deal with those areas where there are vertical bulkheads. It is a problem. We know it's a problem in some of those older neighborhoods. I see the Chatowskis here up there in those lighthouse, Seagate Harbor, and those kind of areas. We're smarter now than we were when those developments were approved back decades ago. We recognize that if you have a vertical bulkhead, you don't get the storage or the treatment of those naturally sloping shorelines, and you have more problems. So Maggie has been diligent in trying to deal with those. They have had to make some exceptions for marinas and other areas where that they are concerned about their ability to develop right close to the edge. Mark showed us some very good pictures about the drainage basins in Martin County. I'm going to take you on a very short but hopefully interesting walk through a couple of those drainage basins. This is a complicated map that it shows the boundary of those basins, and I'm putting some of those green stars to show where the county has been either doing some studies or some actual stormwater retrofits. Martin County has been excellent in getting matching funds to be able to conduct these projects called stormwater retrofits. So I'm going to mention one of them, because if you just have raw land out there someplace, it's easy to figure out the drainage development in this whole pre versus post, where you don't allow any more water to come off the property after the development than beforehand. But where it's particularly challenging for us, and what has caused or added to some of our problems in the whole IRL system, is in those old neighborhoods. So you'll recognize this aerial photo, probably US 1 over there on the left, Dixie Highway here in the Manatee Pocket. And the area that I'd like you to take a look at is right here in the center. This was an aerial photo from back in the 1990s, and the county, even back then, recognized that one of the problems that we've got is with all of the nasty things that run off from urban areas and agricultural areas as well, is causing to our surface waters. So look 10 years later, and there is that same property, and the county has spent, I don't know, Sarah could probably tell us, millions of dollars probably, in creating throughout the county these stormwater treatment areas. And this is one that I think is a particularly good example. It's right in the area where any of you can drive down Flounder Avenue is the best place to park. Right down here near the old historic school, you can park here, small parking lot. But then it's designed for people to come in, do some recreation. I don't think there's any fishing allowed, but you can walk through the property. And what you're not seeing is the biggest point of this, and that is that whole property is taking upland runoff, and it is allowing the natural system to do its things. They planted a variety of plants along the shoreline that uptake those nutrients, and at the same time, as you see from the boardwalks here, it's open to the general public for recreation. Great thing to do. It was controversial at the time, because I think the county did need to go through a process of condemning some land to be able to develop this sort of a project. But these kinds of things are being done at the end of a variety of roads all throughout the county, and it's having a positive effect on the drainage in our system. If the county had not done these things over the last 10 years or so, the effects on the estuary of this past summer would have been a heck of a lot worse than they were. Just another shot of it. The plants that are planted along the shore of the stormwater retrofit projects are all ones that are specifically selected because of their ability to uptake nutrients. They like to take up high phosphorus and nitrogen, that sort of thing. Now the challenge, and this is one of the things that the Water Management District is dealing with constantly, is if you don't remove those plants in the long term, you're not removing them from the system. So what the Water Management District is doing, and we give them some grief for this, because as soon as you get a nicely functioning, ecologically vibrant system, you got to go in and remove them. What we don't want to have happen is what unfortunately is happening in a lot of places, where they just come in, spray the herbicide on those plants. Ultimately, that recirculates the whole problem, and we haven't taken the nutrients out of the system at all. Some of the big challenges, and we all certainly know of them, Mark talked about them, the comp plan is not helping us out with, because we haven't had the ability to do so. The discharges from Lake Okeechobee, very definitely. We're trying our best, but it's a big challenge. Other things that are going on right adjacent to our borders, we don't really have any control over. You probably all saw in the paper back within the last 6 months or so about the development that was approved up in St. Lucie County, a development on septic tanks just right across the county line from us. Well, that was approved unanimously by the St. Lucie County Commission. This is the North Fork of the St. Lucie. So even though we have no specific control over what's going on, we're right there downstream. We can't pretend that that water isn't going to flow down and help kill our oysters and grass beds and everything else. One of the other big challenges that we certainly have, and we're thankful that Florida Oceanographic and Mark are dealing with it so vigorously, are the discharges from the lake and how it's affecting the biota, whether it is starving birds or dead manatees or blue claw crabs, whatever, what do they call it, the charismatic megafauna, those manatees and that sort of thing. They get all of the publicity. But it's the small organisms and the crabs and all that are affecting the fishery probably for decades. We're still going ahead and we're spraying those herbicides in the canals to kill the plants right across from the manatee pocket and other areas. I think we all have to be concerned with the results that the Orca folks came up with when the Stewart News, very thankfully, sponsors a study to go out and do some water quality analysis in the lagoon. And indeed, they found traces of various herbicides and pesticides in our river waters. Well, we're going to have to change our practices if we're not going to have that continue. Another thing that is a big challenge for us, very definitely, is inlet management. What we have not done, I don't think, in the big picture, done well enough, is analyze how that inlet